In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and a world that has already been eaten. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about Nyle Borrodh, a boat dresser on a Munitorum transport. His entire job is measuring the tension on the things that hold a ship together. Then, the navigator died at his station. The ship came down on a mining world called Felbreck, and 43 people crawled out of the wreck onto a planet the Tyranids had already finished with. The 6 evacuation ships on the spaceport pads have been sitting there for months, fueled and loaded, with everyone still in their seats. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The first bolt I lost was a number 9 structural, port side, frame 47. I know that because I had my wrench on it when the ship hit atmosphere, and the frame buckled inward hard enough to spit the head clean off and send it past my ear like a bullet. That was how I learned we were crashing. Not from the alarms, which had been screaming for the better part of an hour and had long since become furniture. Not from the intercom, which had stopped working somewhere around the point the lights went brown. I learned we were dying because a bolt I had dressed 6 days ago fired itself at my skull, and the only reason I am still here to write any of this down is that I had bent down to check the torque on its neighbor. My name is Borrodh, Nyle Borrodh, rating 2nd class, bolt dresser on the Earnest Compliance, which was a Munitorum transport of the Jericho pattern and is now a long smear of metal on a world whose name I did not know until I had been standing on it for a day. I know it now. I expect I will go on knowing it. I dressed bolts, structural bolts, frame bolts, keel plate bolts, the big ugly ones that held the drive housing to the spinal truss, and the small fiddly ones that held the inspection panels to the bulkheads. 411 souls on a ship carrying ammunition and rations, and 80 soldiers in the cold berths for a garrison rotation, 3 systems along, and my job was to make sure the frame stayed where the frame was supposed to be. I was not important. Nobody should mistake me for a man who had opinions anyone listened to. Before any of that, there was the translation. A real space translation runs through a hull as one shove that arrives everywhere at once, and we were not due one. We were 11 days into a passage with weeks left on it, running the Old Darren stretch, because the Old Darren stretch was the short way to where the soldiers in the cold berths were going, and because the charts said it was clean to sail through. A ship that arrives when it is not due has arrived because something went wrong at the top of it. What went wrong at the top of it had been going wrong for the better part of a week, and I had been walking past it without a name for it. The astropath stopped coming to the mess. The shift change went quiet in a way I noticed, because a shift change is 60 people, and it is never quiet. A rating I had known for years asked me whether I had been sleeping badly, and then would not say why he wanted to know. I logged none of that because none of it is structural. What I logged was that the hull had started ringing at a frequency it had not rung at the week before. I put it down to a bearing somewhere aft. Being right would not have helped. There was nothing anybody aboard could have done except stop, and you cannot stop in the warp. On the 11th day, the navigator died at his station, and the astropath died about a minute later. That leaves a shipmaster with a hull in the warp, no eyes on it, and a field around it that runs on a power budget and is the only reason anything inside is still a person. There is one order available to a man in that position, and Lutin gave it inside the minute. We came out where we were rather than where we were going, and where we were was Felbreck, and Felbreck has a gravity well. I did not know any of this at the time. Arsto found it in the log 4 days later. in the second officer's handwriting. 4 lines, and then nothing. And by then, Lutton had been dead for 3 days. He never mentioned it. He spent his last 9 hours on salvage priorities and a casualty count, and never once said out loud that the reason there was anything to count was an order he had given in the dark, with about 40 seconds to think about it. The Earnest Compliance came apart in 3 stages. I felt all of them through the frame, the way a surgeon feels a pulse. Stage 1 was the drive section tearing free. I was between decks in the crawl space between frames 40 and 52 where the keel plate bolts run, and the sound the spinal truss made when it lost its aft quarter was a sound I hope I never have to describe to anyone who has heard a healthy ship. It was not a bang, it was a groan, low and long, like something enormous giving up on holding itself together, and I felt the resonance travel up through the frame into my hands, and knew in my professional estimation that we had lost everything behind frame 60. Stage 2 was the belly hitting something solid, the crawl space compressed by about 1/3, and I was suddenly lying flat with a crossbeam against my back, and my wrench somewhere underneath me, and the air full of metal dust. Stage 3 was the ship doing what ships do when they hit ground at speed. Slide, dig, twist, stop. In that order, each of them long enough for me to understand it, and not long enough to do anything about it. I lay in the dark for what felt like a very long time, but was probably about 20 minutes. I know that because the emergency lumens came on, which they are designed to do after a delay to allow the power cells to stabilize, and they cast everything in that particular shade of red that means the ship thinks you are in serious trouble and would like you to leave. The crawl space had come down far enough that I was moving on my belly. I could hear people. Some of them were shouting. Some of them were making noises that were not shouting. Somewhere ahead of me, the hull was open because there was air coming down the crawl space that had not come out of any system on that ship. It was warm. It was wet. It pushed against my face, slow and steady, the way air moves when something much larger than a corridor is breathing at the far end of it, and I went toward it because it was the only direction there was. I followed the emergency lumens forward, past frames that had buckled and frames that had held, and one frame that had sheared clean through its mounting plate and was hanging by a single bolt, which I noted with a kind of reflex professional disapproval, even as I was crawling through wreckage with blood on my hands that was not mine. I came out through an access hatch on the port side of the main cargo deck. The deck was tilted about 15 degrees to starboard, and the overhead was cracked open along a weld seam, and through that crack I could see light. Not ship light, light from outside. It was the color of a bruise, a kind of yellowish gray that made me think of infected skin, and there was something in the air that I noticed before I noticed anything else. A thick, wet heaviness that sat in my throat and tasted like nothing I had a word for. There were people on the cargo deck. Some of them were moving. Some of them were not going to move again. A woman I knew by sight from the galley crew was sitting against a cargo container with her legs at an angle that meant she was done walking, and she looked at me as I came through the hatch and said something I did not hear, because a man 3 meters away was screaming and not stopping. I will spare the details. There were bodies. There were pieces of things that had been part of a working ship that morning and were now wreckage. And the difference between a ship and wreckage is about 2 minutes of uncontrolled descent. 43 people came out of the Earnest Compliance alive. 43 out of 411. A number I have had a lot of time to think about since, and have not found a way to make it mean anything other than what it means. The cold berths survived partially, a polite way of saying that about 1/3 of them held their seals and the rest did not. And the difference between those two outcomes for the soldiers inside was the difference between waking up confused on a strange world and not waking up at all. The Munitorum ships a rotation draft cold because a sleeping man eats a fraction of what a waking one does across a 4-month passage. That is a saving somebody calculated once, and the calculation did not have a line in it for what happens to a sealed berth at impact. 15 soldiers, 28 crew. Shipmaster Lutton was alive when they pulled him out of the bridge section, which had folded like a fist around the command throne and crushed everything in it except, somehow, the man sitting in it. He was conscious. His back was broken in 2 places and his legs were not responding, and he knew it. And the first thing he said when they got him clear was to ask for a casualty count, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. And the second thing he said was to ask where we had come down, which nobody could answer. He died 9 hours later. Internal bleeding, according to a galley hand who had done a field dressing course, and a soldier trained in first aid to the level the Munitorum considers adequate, enough to stop bleeding and not enough to do anything about what is happening underneath. Lutton was lucid for most of those 9 hours, and spent them giving clear, ordered instructions to Bosun Arstow about what to salvage, what to secure, and how to organize the survivors. He did this lying on a cargo blanket on the tilted deck of his own wrecked ship with his legs not working and his color going bad. And when he finished, he asked Arstow to find the ship law and make sure the final entry was accurate. She told him she would. He said good and closed his eyes, and that was the last useful thing the Earnest Compliance produced. Nobody said anything over him. The Compliance carried no confessor. A bulk hauler of our tonnage does not rate one. What it rates is a shrine, which on our ship was a recess in the corridor, outside the number 2 mess with an acola bolted to the back wall and a rack for candles. And the candles were stores, and stores require a signature, so the shrine belonged administratively to whichever rating was willing to sign for the candle allocation each quarter. That had been a man called Heskett from the galley section. Heskett did not come out of the hull, so when Lutton died, there was nobody whose job it was to say the words. Arstow got through about half of them from memory, and the half she got right was the half everyone knows. Then she stopped because the rest was not there, and she was not going to invent it. A bosun who was not a devout woman doing an approximate job, because the man with the signature was under the decking. I stepped through the hull breach on the port side about an hour after the crash, once it was clear that the immediate business of pulling people out of wreckage was done and somebody needed to look at where we actually were. I went because I was on my feet and had 2 working hands and no injuries worse than cuts, and because Bosun Arstow pointed at me and said, "Go." That was how decisions were made in those first hours, and for most of the time after. Felbreck. The world is called Felbreck. Nobody told me so. I got it off the markings on the mining infrastructure, which was everywhere, because Felbreck was a mining world. The Earnest Compliance had come down on a slope of dark rock between a ridgeline and what had once been a processing complex. A cluster of refineries and ore-crushing mills and conveyor housings spread across maybe 2 kilometers of terrain. I could see all of this. I could see the buildings, the gantries, the rail lines, the slag heaps. I could see the shape of a world that had been built for work, laid out by people who cared about efficiency and not much else. And it looked almost normal in the way a corpse looks, almost like a sleeping person, until you notice the thing that tells you it is not. The thing I noticed was the ground. Not all of it. Patches. Between the rock and the slag and the hard-packed dirt of the roadways, there were patches of something else. It was darker than the surrounding surface, and it had a texture that was not geological, a kind of ridged, layered quality that made me think of muscle tissue or the inside of a throat. I knelt down and touched it, and it was warm. Not sun warm, warm from inside, the way skin is warm. And when I pulled my hand away, there was a residue on my fingers that was not dirt and not water and not anything I was prepared to identify. The air was worse up close to the ground. That wet thickness I had noticed inside the ship was stronger out here, and it had a direction to it, a sense that it was coming from somewhere specific. I looked up and saw the sky and understood one more thing about the situation we were in. The sky over Felbreck was not right. The cloud cover, if it was cloud cover, had a color and a movement to it that did not match any weather pattern I had seen on any world, and I have been on 9 of them. It moved too slowly, it pulsed, and at the horizon, in the direction I later learned was east, something rose out of the landscape that was not a building and not a mountain, and not anything that belonged on a world that had been classified in the shipping manifest as Felbreck, Mining World, Subsector Oldarin, Tithe Grade Exactus Tertius. It was enormous, and it was alive, and I did not know what it was, but my body knew, because my body turned around and walked back toward the wreck without waiting for my brain to finish processing what it had seen. And I think that was the smartest thing any part of me has done before or since. There were 7 more of them. I counted later, from higher ground, though counting is not the right word for what you do when you stand on a ridge and look at a landscape full of structures that are growing out of the planet like organs out of a body. I did not know the word for them then. I know it now, and I am not going to use it. They went from the surface to the upper atmosphere, and they were wider at the base than the ore-crushing mill, and they pulsed with a rhythm that I felt in my teeth. And at the top of each one, where it disappeared into that wrong sky, something was moving. Slowly, patiently, drinking. I went back to the wreck and told Arsto what I had seen, and she took her time about answering. And what she finally said summarizes the entire experience of being on Felbreck better than anything anyone has managed since. "Well," she said, "that is not ideal." Lieutenant Gethin came out of a cold berth with frost still on his eyelashes and started running the situation within about 40 minutes, which I think is a record for a man who had been half frozen 3 hours earlier. Being entitled to run it took him another day and a half. I do not know if I liked him. I do not think that was the point of him. He was a guard officer of the kind the Munitorum produces in volume, young, competent, with a face that looked like it had been designed to deliver bad news without flinching. He woke up, assessed, and asked 5 questions that were the right 5 questions, and then he ran into the only obstacle on that hillside, which was that he had no authority over a single one of us. A guard lieutenant aboard a Munitorum hull is cargo with opinions. The crew of the Earnest Compliance answered to the shipmaster, and after the shipmaster to the senior surviving ship's officer, and Luton had spent his last 9 hours making perfectly clear who that was. Arsto gave it to him on the 2nd morning. I was restowing a cargo net a few paces off, and heard the whole thing. It contained no ceremony of any kind. A bosun's authority is authority over a ship, she told him, and there was no longer a ship, and what was left was a defensive problem she was not trained for. He asked whether she was certain. The 15 men with las guns were going to take orders from him, whatever either of them decided, and she would rather that arrangement was written down correctly than happen by itself. Then she asked for one thing in return, which was the ship's log, and he said, "Take it," in the tone of a man being asked for something he had no use for. So Gethin had 15 soldiers, and I had 27 crew and 1 bosun who had just made herself a quartermaster. He did not ask for a vote. He did not make a speech. He said we are staying with the wreck until we know what is out there. And then he posted sentries and told the rest of us to start cataloging what we had. And that was that. What we had was this. Enough rations for 43 people for about 30 days, assuming nobody took more than their share. Water for about the same, if the reclamation unit in the aft section still worked, which Ulmenden said it did, but he would not promise for how long, because nothing on this ship was designed to operate lying on its side in a ditch. Weapons for the soldiers. Lost guns, standard pattern, rather more than half of the rack still functional. A survival rate the Munitorum would have logged as within expected tolerance for the racking, plus 2 las pistols from the bridge locker and Gethin's own sidearm. Ammunition in quantity, because the ship's cargo had been ammunition among other things, and the Emperor in his infinite wisdom had arranged for us to crash on a world where we had more things to shoot with than things to eat, which felt about right for how the Imperium manages its affairs. Medical supplies that amounted to a few field kits, a bottle of counterseptic, and the collected medical knowledge of a galley hand and a rifleman. One cog adept of the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose name was Ulmenden. Ulmenden was the ship's engineer, one engineer for a vessel of 411 souls, the Mechanicus allocation for a transport of that tonnage, and it tells you everything you need to know about how the Mechanicus values a Munitorum bulk hauler. He was a quiet man, or a quiet whatever he was, because by the time I met him, he had enough augmetic replacement in him that the question of what was man and what was machine was not one I felt comfortable answering. He had a voice like 2 pieces of metal being rubbed together, and he moved with a precision that made everyone around him look like they were guessing. And on a working ship, he spent most of his time in the engine room talking to things that could not answer him in any language I recognized. On the Earnest Compliance, Ulmenden had been background, part of the machinery. Now, on a broken ship on a world full of things that wanted to eat the hull, he was the most important person any of us had ever met, and he knew it, and it did not make him happy. The first organisms came on the second night, not the big ones, not the things I had nightmares about for weeks after. Small things, things the size of my fist, or smaller, moving across the ground in a carpet that flowed like liquid and covered every surface it touched. They came to the blood. The crash had left biological material on the ground around the hull. Blood and worse. And in the morning light I had noticed that the ground near the breach points had changed color overnight, had gone darker and softer, and when I looked closer I could see the surface moving, a fine rippling motion that was thousands of small organisms processing everything organic they could find. They ate the blood, they ate the scraps of tissue, they ate the leather from a boot that someone had left near the hull breach. They did not come inside, not that night, and in the morning they were gone, and the ground where they had been was smooth and clean and slightly warm to the touch, as if something underneath had digested a meal and was resting. We lost our first man to them on the 4th day. Raiding Quinard, who had gone out to check on the aft water tanks, and had cut his hand on a torn hull plate, and had sat down to wrap it and had fallen asleep. Because he was exhausted and hurt, and people do that. He was 30 meters from the wreck. We found him at dawn, or we found most of him. The small ones had come for the blood on the bandage, and had kept going, and what they left was clean, very clean, cleaner than any wound I have ever seen, because they do not tear, they dissolve, and they do it with a patience that makes the word feeding feel wrong. It was not feeding, it was processing. The same way a machine processes raw material into something else, except the machine was alive and the raw material had been a man I had shared a meal with 2 days earlier. That was when we learned the first rule of Felbreck. Keep your blood inside your body. Wrap every cut. Burn the bandages. Do not sleep outside. It is not in any manual. The manuals assume the ground is on your side. The bigger ones came later. Creatures the size of large dogs, or small horses depending on the variant, and I could not tell you what they were called because I did not know and nobody in our group did. They came in groups of 3 to 6, moving fast, and they hunted the way animals hunt, without coordination or planning, driven by instinct and hunger and whatever passes for aggression in a thing that has no brain worth the name. The soldiers killed them. It was not difficult at first. A las gun works well on chitin and muscle, and the things came head-on with no concept of cover or flanking. They ran at the loudest noise and the closest movement, and they died, and we dragged the corpses away from the wreck, and by morning the small ones had processed them too, and the only evidence that a fight had happened was the last burns on the rocks, and the fact that we had 3 fewer power cells than we had started with. But more came. Not the same ones. Different shapes, different sizes, some with limbs I did not have names for, and some that moved in ways I could not track. The ground around the wreck was a hunting territory, and we were in it, and the things out there were not intelligent and were not coordinated. But there were a lot of them, and they were always hungry, and they did not stop coming. Not in waves, not in attacks. In 1s and 2s, probing, testing, coming from different directions at different times, and each one we killed attracted the small ones, and each time the small ones came, they stayed a little longer and came a little closer to the hull, and I understood something about this world that I wish I had understood sooner, which is that on Felbreck, everything is food, and the only question is how long it takes for something to work out how to eat you. Gethin understood it too, in his own way, in the way of a man who thinks in perimeters and fields of fire. He set up a watch rotation that had 4 people on at all times, a significant commitment for a group of 43 that was already down to 42. And he had Iskara run the sentries, which was the smartest thing he did, because Iskara was the kind of sergeant who could keep people awake and alert through sheer force of personality. Terrifying in a quiet, professional way that made the organisms outside seem straightforward by comparison. She had a way of looking at a man who was falling asleep on watch that communicated more about the consequences of that decision than any speech could have. And I speak from personal experience because she caught me dozing on the 3rd night, and the look she gave me kept me awake for the next 40 hours out of pure self-preservation. She was also, and I did not learn this until the 2nd week, the person who checked on the wounded every evening after her watch ended. She sat with them and did not say much, and brought water when the galley hand forgot, and she did it at the cost of an hour of sleep she could not afford to lose, and I never once heard her mention it to anyone. The only reason I know is that I was in the crawl space under the aft section checking bolts at the wrong hour, and saw her through a gap in the deck plate, sitting next to a man with a crushed pelvis, holding a cup steady because his hands could not. On the 5th day, I inspected the structure. I went through the wreck frame by frame, the parts I could still access, and I checked every bolt and every weld and every join, and I wrote it all down in a maintenance log I had salvaged from the engineering stores. It was the only thing I had left that made any sense. The results were not encouraging. The hull was holding, but the crash had stressed the frame beyond its design tolerances in at least 30 locations that I could identify, and the atmospheric conditions on Felbreck were accelerating degradation in ways I had never seen before. The moisture in the air was not ordinary moisture. It left a film on metal surfaces that was slightly acidic, not enough to burn skin, but enough to eat into steel over time. And when I checked the bolts I had dressed before the crash, I found corrosion patterns that would normally take months developing in less than a week. I reported this to Gethin, and he asked me how long the wreck would hold, and I told him I could give him a number, but it would be a lie. So he asked me to give him the lie, and I said 6 months, maybe 8. And he nodded and did not ask me what I actually thought, which was less than that. Ulmenden took the corrosion harder than anyone. He would go to the engine room, which was half collapsed and mostly inaccessible, and he would sit with his back against the remains of the main drive housing and perform rites that I did not understand and that were not for me to understand. And when he came back, he was always quieter than when he had gone in. The ship was dying. Not the way a machine breaks down, not the way a vehicle rusts in a yard. Dying the way Ulmenden understood dying. Lutin had been a man, and men die, and that is understood. A machine being eaten by something biological was an offense against the order of things he carried in whatever served him for a soul. 2 days after that, we saw the lictor for the first time, though I did not know what it was, and calling it seeing is generous. Riddick was on the eastern sentry post, which overlooked the slope down to the processing complex, and he reported movement against the wall of the nearest refinery building. Not on the wall, against it. Something large, something that had been part of the wall and then was not. A ripple in the surface of the building that detached and moved, and then was still again. And by the time anyone else looked, there was nothing there except a wall that looked the same as it always had. Riddock was not a nervous man. He was a quiet, steady soldier who did not report things he had not seen, and when he described what he had observed, he did it in flat, precise language that did not leave room for interpretation. Something big had been pressed against that wall, matching its color and texture perfectly, and it had moved when he looked at it, and then it had stopped moving and he could not find it again. Gethin doubled the watch on the eastern post. I do not think it mattered. Whatever Riddock had seen was not the kind of thing that cared about sentries. It was watching us the way we watch weather. Not because it was afraid of us, but because we were a condition it was taking into account. And the difference between those two things is the difference between being a threat and being a feature of the landscape. And I did not enjoy learning which one we were. On the 9th day, Gethin decided we needed to move. Not because the wreck was failing, though it was, but because we needed water. The reclamation unit had given up on day 6, 4 days ahead of Ulmenden's worst estimate, and the remaining stores would last us maybe a week if we were careful, and less than that if we were not. Felbreck had water. You could see it pooled in the low ground between the slag heaps, gathered in the basins of the mining infrastructure. It looked like water. It sat in depressions and reflected the sky and had a surface that rippled when the wind touched it. And for about 30 seconds on the first day, I had been relieved to see it until I got close enough to notice that it smelled wrong and that the color was not quite right. A faint yellowish tinge that could have been mineral content but was not, and that the surface tension was different, thicker, as if the liquid was heavier than water had any right to be. We tested it with the field kit and the results were inconclusive, which in practical terms meant nobody was willing to drink it, and so water meant finding the mining complex's supply infrastructure, its storage tanks and piping and whatever else working mining operation uses to keep 12 million people alive on a world with marginal surface water, and hoping that somewhere in that infrastructure was a sealed reservoir that had not been contaminated. The expedition was 12 people: Gethin, Iskara, 8 soldiers, me, and Ulmenden, who came because the complex would have machinery, and Ulmenden could not be in the same solar system as machinery without wanting to look at it. We left at first light, which on Felbreck was a relative term because the sky never fully brightened. It just went from dark gray to a kind of sickly amber that passed for daytime and gave everything a flat, shadowless quality that made distances hard to judge. The walk was 2 kilometers. It took us 4 hours. Not the terrain. What was on it? The landscape between the wreck and the complex was in transition, and walking through it was like walking through the stages of a disease. Near the wreck, the ground was still mostly rock, hard and dark and familiar, with patches of that organic tissue I had seen on the first day, isolated, growing in the cracks and depressions where moisture gathered. Farther out, the patches connected. The organic material covered the rock in a continuous layer, soft and yielding under boot, warm to the touch, threaded with ridges and channels that carried fluid in directions that had nothing to do with the slope of the ground. It was not comfortable to walk on. It was not designed for walking on. It was designed for digestion, and that is what it was doing, breaking the surface rock down into something the organisms could use. It was not breaking us down yet. We were not the right material yet. The buildings of the processing complex were still standing, mostly. Row-site walls and plasteel frames and metal roofing, all of it intact enough to recognize as architecture, but covered every surface in a layer of organic growth that softened every edge and filled every joint, and made the whole complex look like it had been dipped in something alive and left to set. The growth was thicker here, more structured, with forms that resembled fungal bodies or the fruiting structures of something I did not want to think about too carefully. In places, it had forced its way through windows and doorways and filled interior spaces with a mass of tissue that pulsed faintly when you stood near it. And I want to be clear that I am not using the word pulsed as a figure of speech. It was pulsing. It had a rhythm, slow, regular, like a heartbeat running far slower than a man's, and I felt it through the soles of my boots before I heard it with my ears. Iskara lost Trooper Beldane in the third building we entered. He was at the rear of the column, which was where Iskara put the people she trusted least to keep their heads, and the thing that took him was fast and quiet and came down out of the ceiling. It dropped. It took him, and by the time the rest of us turned around, there was nothing in the corridor except Beldane's last gun on the floor and a smear of something on the wall that was already being absorbed by the growth. No sound, no struggle that any of us heard. Just a man who was there and then was not, and a weapon lying on the ground with the safety still on, which meant he never even knew. Iskara looked at the smear and the gun and the ceiling, and she said to Gethin, in a tone that was perfectly level and perfectly controlled, that we were being stalked, and that whatever was doing it was above us and ahead of us, and had been since we entered the complex. Gethin asked her how she knew it was ahead of us. She said because it chose the last man in the line, which means it is between us and the exit, and it is confident enough not to need the closest target. We lost one more person before we found the water. A soldier whose name I did not know and whose death I did not see, only heard. A sound from 2 rooms behind us that lasted about 3 seconds and then stopped. Gethin did not send anyone to look. He did not have to explain why. The water was in an underground cistern beneath the main processing hall, sealed behind a hatch that Ulmenden opened with a combination of brute force and a prayer I did not recognize. It was clean. Clean enough, anyway, enough to fill the containers we had brought, and enough to make the trip back worthwhile, which it needed to be because the trip back cost us nothing, only because Iskara made us walk pressed against the interior walls with weapons pointing at the ceiling the entire way, and the thing in the walls, whatever it was, did not take anyone else. I think it had eaten enough for one day. Whether it was full or bored or saving us is a question for somebody with more curiosity than I had left. 2 days later, Gethin sent a second expedition. Not for water, for hope. Because Bosun Arstow had found something in the ship's navigation charts, which were stored on a local cogitator that had survived the crash, and what she had found was the location of the Felbreck orbital dock and planet-side terminal, which, in plain language, meant a spaceport, 14 kilometers to the northwest on the far side of the ridge line. 14 kilometers through a landscape that was actively digesting itself, past things that hunted from walls and ceilings, over ground that was warm and wet and breathing. But a spaceport meant ships. Ships meant engines. Engines meant a chance, however small, of getting off this world. And hope is a currency that spends faster than rations and runs out sooner. So Gethin spent it while he had it. I went. I did not volunteer. Arsto pointed at me again, and I went. Because that was the arrangement we had arrived at, and because, if I am being honest, 14 kilometers of nightmare felt preferable to sitting in a dying ship waiting for the small ones to find a way through the hull. Which they would, because everything on Felbreck finds a way, eventually. We crossed the defense line on the second morning, and I did not know that was what it was until Iskara told me. It ran across the saddle between two spoil heaps, and what was left was earthworks and firing positions and the concrete sockets where somebody had bolted down heavy weapons, all of it dug properly and sighted properly by people who knew what they were doing. No bodies, no weapons, no wire, no shell holes, nothing burned. Felbreck had been cleaned. Whatever the planetary defense force of this world put on that saddle went into the same ground everything else went into, and the ground had closed over it. And by the time we walked across it, the positions were just shapes under a skin of growth, the way a buried pipe run shows through a floor. Iskara walked it, reading the layout, and then said they had held here, and I asked her how she could tell, and she said because the positions face outward, and there are no second positions behind them. Nobody built a fallback. 12 million people and one line. And the least bad reading I have been able to arrive at since is that they were never defending the world. They were defending the road, and the road went northwest, and northwest was where we were going. We walked. The landscape got worse. The organic coverage went from patches to continuous to dominant, and by the time we crossed the ridgeline, we were walking on a surface that had no rock in it at all, just layers of processed tissue that gave underfoot like thick carpet and made a sound when you stepped on it that I have never found a comparison for. We saw organisms, swarms of the small ones, rivers of them flowing across the terrain in channels that looked engineered, carrying material from one pool to another. Larger things in the distance, shapes against the skyline that moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the feral hunters near our camp look like insects by comparison. We kept low. We kept quiet. We moved when the wind blew because everything else was moving then too. We reached the spaceport on the evening of the second day. It was on a plateau, a flat expanse of reinforced rockcrete that had been graded and surfaced for orbital landers, with service buildings along the northern edge and fuel storage along the south, and a control tower in the center that was still standing, still recognizable, still bearing the markings of the Departmento Munitorum and the merchant fleet, and a faded Aquila that someone had painted on the eastern face at some point in the history of a world that no longer had a history. There were 6 ships on the landing pads. 6. I counted them from the ridge line, and I counted them again from the edge of the plateau, and the number did not change. 6 ships, from a small in-system shuttle up to a bulk lighter, all of them sitting on their landing gear on a surface that was cracked but intact. And for about 90 seconds I felt something that I will not call hope, because hope implies that you believe the thing you are hoping for is possible, and what I felt was more like a reflex, a spasm of the nervous system that mistook the shape of a ship for the shape of an escape. Gethin sent Iskara and 2 soldiers to check the nearest vessel, while the rest of us held position on the perimeter. I watched them cross the pad. I watched Iskara reach the hull and touch it and look at her hand, and then look up at the ship and stand very still for a moment. She went to the next one. and the next. She came back across the pad at a pace that was not quite running and not quite walking, and she stopped in front of Gethin and gave her report. Every ship was full, loaded. Passengers in the seats, cargo in the holds, fuel in the tanks. The bulk lighter alone had 186. Some of them were still strapped in. Some of them had moved before they died, had tried to get out, had clawed at hatches that were sealed from the command deck. All of them dead for weeks. The growth had come in through the ventilation and done what it does, and what was left in those seats is not something I want to put a word to. There was one detail I did not expect and have not been able to put down since. In the bulk lighter, in the rows nearest the forward bulkhead where the seating was better and the families had been loaded first, a great many of the dead had their hands together. Not clutched, not clawing, folded and held that way long enough that the growth had set around them and kept the shape. They had been sealed in a hull on a landing pad, waiting for a sky that was never going to open. And at some point in that wait, a large number of them had stopped watching the hatch and started doing the only other thing a citizen of the Imperium is ever taught to do about a situation. Arsto saw it too. She had been saying words over our dead since the crash, approximately and out of duty and getting the same half of it right every time, and she stopped after the bulk lighter and she never started again, and I did not ask her about it, because I had seen the same rows she had, and I could do the arithmetic on how much good it had done them. They had never taken off. 6 ships on a spaceport with fuel in their tanks and people in their seats, and not one of them had ever left the ground. Gethin went to the control tower. The logs were still there, stored on a system that was running on emergency power and had been running on emergency power for months. And the logs said what the logs said, which was this. When the evacuation order came, they loaded the ships. They loaded them in order, by priority, families first, then essential personnel, then everyone else. And they did it efficiently and quickly because the people running the evacuation were mining administrators, and mining administrators are good at moving large numbers of people through choke points on a schedule. I did that arithmetic at the tower console. 6 hulls, call it 1,000 seats, against 12 million people. Everybody who wrote that order knew the number before they wrote it. There was never an evacuation of Felbreck. There was an evacuation of everyone who could produce a docket at the spaceport gate, worded generally because a general instruction is easier to sign than a list of names. The other 12 million were not left behind, which would at least have been a decision. They went on working their shifts under a sky that was already changing color. 6 ships went aboard inside a single working day, and the pad cleared for launch, and the first of them, the shuttle, powered up its drives and requested clearance for orbital ascent, and the Navigator, a daughter of a minor Navis house under charter to the Felbreck run, sat down at her station and reached for the warp, and found nothing. Not static, not interference, nothing. A wall, a void where the immaterium had been so total and so absolute that she described it in the log as being blind, not in the sense of darkness, but in the sense that the organ she used to see it with had been disconnected from the thing it was designed to perceive. The astropath on the second ship went into convulsions before the hour was out, and did not come out of them. The third ship's navigator managed a partial reading and reported that what was in the warp was not the warp. It was a presence so vast and so singular that looking at it was like pressing your eye against a wall and trying to see the building. They could not leave. The drives worked. The fuel was there. The sky was right there, clear and reachable, and on the other side of it was the emptiness between stars that should have taken them home. But the space between here and home ran through the immaterium, and the immaterium was occupied by something that did not have a name in any language spoken on Felbreck. and no navigator in the system was willing to open a passage into it, because opening a passage into what was in there was not travel. It was surrender. So they sat on the pad and waited. Some thought the interference would pass. Some of them thought reinforcements would come from outside the system. The logs ran for 11 days. On the 12th day, the organisms reached the plateau. The last entry in the log was a maintenance notation filed automatically by the control tower's machine spirit, recording a drop in external temperature consistent with biological overgrowth of the sensor array. Nobody wrote the last entry. Nobody was left to write it. The machines kept talking to each other for 3 more weeks after the people stopped. I read those logs twice. 2 things came out of them. The first was that there was no getting off Felbreck. Not for us. Not with a ship. Not without a ship. Not with a prayer or a plan or a miracle. The second was that the thing in the warp, the obstruction, the wall, the presence that had blinded those navigators and silenced those astropaths, was the same thing that had brought us here. The Earnest Compliance had not crashed because of a malfunction or a navigational error. It had crashed because whatever those 3 navigators had put their eyes on had already put its eyes on ours, out in the middle of a passage with nothing anywhere near us, and killed him at his station. The 4 lines in our own log and the whole tower's worth of logs under my hand were the same document written twice. The dead ships on the pad and the wreck on the hillside were the same event, separated by 3 months and nothing else. I could feel it, the way Riddoch had felt the thing on the wall, not with any sense I could name, but with something deeper, a weight in the back of my skull that had been there since the crash, and that I had been calling a headache because calling it a headache was easier than calling it what it was. The sky was closed. The door was locked, and we were on the wrong side of it with 30 days of food, and a hull that was being digested, and a growing collection of things outside that wanted to process us into the same smooth, warm, clean ground that covered everything else on Felbreck. Gethin read the logs after me. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Right," and walked out of the tower and started organizing the salvage of supplies from the dead ships. That is the kind of man he was. The universe tells him there is no exit, and his response is to start stacking crates. Gethin made the decision to move without consulting anyone, which by that point was fine with all of us, because consulting implied options, and options implied choices, and nobody wanted to stand in a circle and discuss the relative merits of dying in one location versus dying in another. Then he had to get us there. Moving 40 people 14 kilometers across that ground took 3 days. It was not a march. A march has a pace. We had a column that could only move at the speed of its slowest load, and our slowest loads were 4 men on improvised litters made from cargo netting and conduit. And a litter needs 4 carriers, and 4 carriers cannot hold a weapon. Do that arithmetic across 16 men, and you have a column where nearly half the able bodies are occupied and the rest are covering a line 400 meters long across terrain that gives underfoot. We carried what we could not replace: water, ammunition, tools, the last of the ship's rations. Everything else stayed in the wreck and stayed there permanently, because a column that is already carrying 4 men on litters has no spare hands, and nobody was ever going back for it. We stopped at dark both nights, because moving in the dark on that surface is how you put a boot through something. Both nights we built a ring of burning cargo netting, and sat inside it and listened, and both nights something walked the edge of the light without ever entering it. The first night we lost a man from a litter party, who stepped left to make room for the man behind him, and went into the hip. The second night the ferals came at the tail of the column where the litters were, and Iskara took the rear with 6 rifles and held it, and we lost one more before it was over, and it was one of the men on the litters, which I record because I want the number right and not because it makes it easier. The spaceport was better. The plateau surface was reinforced rockcrete, poured thick for orbital lander weight, and the organic growth had not penetrated it yet, had crept across it from the edges but had not broken through, which gave us a perimeter of hard ground that the small feeder organisms avoided because there was nothing in rockcrete for them to eat. The service buildings along the northern edge were metal-framed and sealed, designed to withstand the backwash of shuttle engines, and 3 of them were clean inside, free of growth, dry, defensible. We stripped the dead ships of everything useful, which took 2 days and was the worst job I have ever done. And I have dressed bolts in spaces a dog would not crawl into. I have no intention of setting down what it was like to unbuckle the dead from their seats and move them aside to reach the supply lockers behind them. I will say that we did it, and that Iskara supervised, and that she made everyone wash their hands after every shift with counterseptic. We could not afford to waste, but could not afford not to use, because on Felbreck, a scratch that goes unwashed is an invitation the world will accept within hours. I came apart on the 4th day there over a hinge. It was a door hinge on building 2, 3 bolts, one of them seized. I had a wrench and a working elbow and most of an afternoon, and it would not come. At some point, I stopped trying to turn it and started hitting it, and I went on hitting it long after any reasonable man would have stopped. Iskara came over and took the wrench out of my hand. Neither of us mentioned the 2 men we had left on the litters. She stood there holding my wrench. Then she gave it back and went away, and I put a new bolt in, and it went in first time. That is the only occasion on Felbreck when anything came out of me sideways, and it came out at a fitting rather than at a person. The supplies from the dead ships extended our timeline considerably. Rations for maybe 120 days, if we were disciplined. Water from sealed tanks that had not been breached. Tools, equipment, medical supplies that were better than anything we had salvaged from the Compliance. Power cells by the crate, enough to keep the less guns charged for longer than any of us expected to need them. A thought nobody said out loud, but everyone had. The Imperium had provisioned that evacuation generously. It had provisioned it with everything a population needs to leave a world except a direction to leave it in. We also got a working Vox unit from the control tower, which Ulmenden spent the better part of a week calibrating and which received exactly what we expected it to receive, which was nothing. Every frequency was dead. Not static, not interference. Silence. A silence that had weight to it, that pressed against the equipment like a physical force, and Ulmenden said the machine spirit was healthy, and the transmission array was functional, and the problem was not with the machine, but with what was between the machine and everything else. He had no name for it, and neither did I, but he described it as an obstruction in the medium, as if someone had filled the space between here and there with something solid. And his hands shook when he said it, which was the only time I ever saw a part of Ulmenden move without precision. Life at the spaceport settled into a routine. Wake before dawn, which meant nothing on a world where dawn was the sky getting marginally less dark. Meal, rationed, measured by Arsto with a precision that would have impressed the Administratum. Morning inspection, which was my job. Walking the perimeter and checking the buildings and measuring the advance of the organic growth across the rockcrete, which I tracked in a log with the same format I had used for bolt inspections on the Compliance, because the format was the only thing I had left from that life, and I was not ready to give it up. By the second month, I had inspected everything on that plateau twice and started going through the paper in the control tower instead. Port authority circulars and tithe schedules, and a Munitorum threat digest. Nobody had ever opened, because a man who reads nothing eventually starts thinking, and thinking on Felbreck was worse than reading. Then work, whatever work needed doing, which ranged from reinforcing the barricades to sorting supplies to digging latrines far enough from the buildings that the smell would not attract the small organisms, but close enough that a person using them at night would not be outside the sentry line for more than a few minutes, because a few minutes was all it took on Felbreck. The organisms came on a cycle. I mapped it, or tried to. The small feeder organisms came in pulses, flowing across the ground in waves that corresponded roughly to the temperature cycle, more active when it was warmer, less when it cooled. The medium ones, the hunters, the things with chitin and claws and teeth that were not teeth, but serrated biological cutting surfaces, came irregularly but with a frequency that increased over time. In the first week at the spaceport, we saw them every 2 or 3 days. By the third week, it was daily. By the 6th week, they were a constant presence on the perimeter, prowling the edge of the rockcrete where the growth met the hard surface, testing it, looking for a way across that did not involve crossing open ground under the sentry's weapons. They learned the sentry pattern. I did not understand how at the time and had no theory worth the name. And the theory I have now is one I would rather not have. The patrol routes that worked in week 1 did not work in week 4, because by week 4 the things on the perimeter had adjusted, had moved their approach angles, had started coming from the directions we checked least often, and Gethin had to rotate the routes on a schedule that felt arbitrary until you realized it was not arbitrary, it was desperate. We lost people to stupidity and exhaustion and bad luck, and the grinding arithmetic of a small group of human beings living on a world built to convert them into raw material. A soldier stepped off the rockcrete to retrieve a dropped water container, and the ground under his boot gave way, and he went in up to his knee, and the small ones were on him before he could pull free. A woman from the galley crew went out to check the rain traps and did not come back, and we found her kit, but not her. And the thing on the wall of the refinery was never in the same place twice, but was always somewhere. And every few days, someone at the Eastern Sentry Post would report a ripple in the surface of a building or a shadow that moved the wrong way, and we would double the watch and see nothing, and then someone would be gone. 2 people in the first month, 5 in the second. The lictor, if that is what it was, never attacked the group. It took individuals, people who were alone for a moment, people who had stepped away, people who had stopped paying attention for the half-second it takes to scratch an itch or adjust a bootstrap. It was patient in a way that made patience feel like something terrible, and I think it could have taken any of us at any time and chose not to, because it was not hungry. It was curating, selecting, sampling us the way a man samples grain from a silo, not for the taste but for the information. It never touched Gethin, or Ulmendin, or Arsto, or me. None of us was ever outside on our own. Gethin moved with a runner. Ulmendin did not go anywhere the machines were not. Arsto ran stores, and stores are indoors, and I did my inspections along a wall with the wall on my left. Not because I was clever. Riddoch went on day 54. The man who had first seen it, the man who had stood at the eastern post and reported a ripple in the wall and had been steady and calm about it, and had gone back to his post the next morning and the morning after that. He was on sentry at the southern edge, alone for perhaps 90 seconds while his partner walked to the latrine, and when the partner came back, the post was empty, and Riddoch's last gun was on the ground with the stock still warm from his hand. Iskara found marks on the rockcrete, long scraping gouges leading to the edge of the plateau where the growth began, and the gouges ended where the growth began, because nothing leaves a mark on that surface. She stood there for a long time, looking at where the marks stopped. She never mentioned it, then or later, and I did not ask. I had seen that look on people before. It is the one you get when somebody puts a thing in a box in their head and closes the lid, knowing it will not stay closed. Gethin held us together through discipline and routine, and the simple fact that falling apart was not something he was prepared to allow. He ran the camp like a garrison, which it was not, and he treated every day as if it were part of an operational plan, which it was not, and the fiction of purpose was enough to keep most people moving most of the time. He had Iskara drill the soldiers every morning, which served no tactical purpose anyone could identify, and gave men with weapons something to do with their hands. She ran it like the ship was still under her, and after the second week she started putting the crew through it too, on the grounds that a man who has held a last gun once is worth more than a man who has not. He assigned work details and rest periods, and had Arsto run supply inventories on a weekly schedule, and insisted on formal reports from me about the structural status of the buildings, which I delivered in writing, in my maintenance log format, because he understood that a man doing his job is a man who has not yet decided to stop, and on Felbreck, the decision to stop was the last decision a person made. I will not pretend the routine held for everyone. There were fights. A soldier and a rating got into it over food allocation in the fourth week, and Gethin broke it up with a voice that could have cut hull plate, and the soldier spent the next 4 nights on double sentry duty and came back quieter and angrier and more useful. And that was how discipline worked when there was no brig and no regulation and no commissar, and the only punishment available was making someone spend more time closer to the things outside. It worked. Everything Gethin did worked, and that is the part I have had trouble with. The man who came back from those 4 nights is the man who would not get up off the floor of Building 1 on the last night. Gethin put him out there himself. He used the only tool he had, and the tool did what tools do. There were people who stopped eating, people who stopped talking. A man I had known on the Compliance as a cheerful, talkative stores clerk sat against the wall of Building 2 for most of a fortnight and spoke to nobody and ate only what Arsto physically put in his hands. And then one morning he walked out through the barricade at noon, in full view of the sentries, and kept walking. And Gethin said, "Let him go," and nobody argued. The sky changed over time. The structures on the horizon, the ones that reached into the atmosphere, grew taller. More of them appeared. The clouds, if they were clouds, thickened and lowered and took on a color that shifted between amber and a deep biological red that made the light on the ground look like it was being filtered through skin. At night, the sky was not dark. It glowed faintly, unevenly, with a luminescence that came from the structures and from the cloud layer itself, and from something above the clouds that we could not see but could feel. A presence that sat on the upper atmosphere, the way a hand sits on a table, heavy and still and waiting. The pressure under my skull got worse. It was not a headache anymore, and I had stopped pretending it was. It was a pressure, a low, constant hum that sat below hearing and above thought, and it was stronger at night and stronger when the sky glowed, and strongest of all when the wind came from the east, from the direction of the structures, and brought with it a smell that was not decay and not rot, but something else, something alive and enormous and digesting, the exhalation of a process so vast that a planet was the meal and the sky was the throat. On the 43rd day, I did my structural inspection of Building 1, and found something that changed the arithmetic of our situation in a way I did not immediately share with anyone. The bolts on the main door frame, the ones I had checked and tightened on our second day at the spaceport, had lost 9% of their cross-section to corrosion. 24 days on fasteners rated for decades of service in standard atmospheric conditions. I checked the frame bolts on Building 2 and found 12%. Building 3, which was closest to the edge of the plateau where the growth was thickest, had lost 14. The atmospheric corrosion was accelerating, and it was not uniform. It was worse where the air was thicker with whatever biological material was in it, and the air was getting thicker every day because the growth on the plateau edge was advancing at a rate I could measure in my log, centimeter by centimeter, day by day, digesting the rockcrete the way it digested everything else, just slower. I ran the numbers that night, sitting in the corner of Building 1 with my maintenance log and a pencil stub, and the kind of cold mathematics that does not care about morale or hope or the human need to believe that tomorrow will be different from today. At the current rate of degradation, the structural integrity of our shelter would fall below what I considered safe in about 70 days. 70 days before the bolts holding the door frames would not hold the door frames, before the roof panels would start to separate, before the seals on the windows would fail, and the atmospheric moisture and the small organisms it carried would get inside and start doing to us what they had done to the people on the ships. 70 days, we had rations for 80. The food would outlast the shelter, which struck me as exactly the kind of efficiency the universe would produce, and which no requisition form has a box for. And I wrote the number in my log and went to sleep and dreamed about bolts, which was the only kind of dream I had on Felbreck that did not wake me up screaming. Gethin got it the next morning. Not the number. The situation. The buildings were degrading. The rate was increasing. We had a window, and it was closing. He looked at me with that flat, assessing expression he used when someone was telling him something he already suspected, and he asked me what I recommended. I told him I was a bolt dresser, not an architect, and my recommendation was to keep tightening bolts until there was nothing left to tighten, which was what I had been doing my entire career, and the only difference was that on the compliance the bolts had the courtesy to stay tightened. He almost smiled. It was the closest I ever saw him come to it. The days ran together after that. No chronometer, no day and night worth the name, and one day divided from the next by agreement rather than by anything you could look at. We kept time by meals and watches and the entries in my log. Day 45, day 51, day 60. I was the only man on that plateau keeping a calendar, and I was keeping it in a bolt inspection log in the column-headed remarks. I have the dates off that log in front of me now, and they are the only reason any of this is in order. The numbers climbed, and the group shrank, and the growth came across the rockcrete like a tide that never went out, and I tightened bolts that had less substance in them every week, and wrote the measurements down, and the measurements got worse. A man who has a job he can do does not yet have to decide what kind of man he is without one. By day 60, we were 31, 12 people gone since the crash, not all of them to the organisms, and I can account for every one of them because accounting was the only authority I had. Quenard on the 4th day, to the small ones. Beldane and a soldier whose name I never learned in the processing complex. 2 to the lictor after that, which by then I had stopped thinking of as a threat and started thinking of as weather. 2 on the march to the spaceport, 1 to the ground and 1 to the ferals at the tail of the column. 1 to the store's clerk's walk, 1 to an injury that went septic. We were adequate for splints and useless for infection, and the air on Felbreck was optimized for breaking down organic tissue, and 3 to a night when the growth came up through the floor of Building 3, and what came through the breach was not the small ones and not the feral hunters, but something larger and faster and much harder to kill. And we lost Building 3 and 3 people and 200 rounds of ammunition, and the 34 people who had gone to sleep in 3 buildings woke up as 31 people in 2. Every one of those was also a ration allocation that got slightly larger for everyone else, which is a thing you notice at the meal after and do not say out loud at the meal after. Ulmenden never saw the compliance again after the march. 14 kilometers in that direction was not a distance anyone was going to walk twice, and he knew it when we left, and he was the last man out of the wreck on the morning we started. He had gone down into the engine spaces one final time and come back up and said nothing to anybody for the whole first day of the column. What the wreck became after that he had to work out from what he already knew, which was that the atmospheric degradation was through the exposed hull sections, and the frame was showing in places like bone through skin, and the growth was into the interior spaces, and what was out there now was not a ship. It was a cavity, a shell, a shape that remembered being a vessel the way a skull remembers being a face. One evening around day 50, in that grinding metal voice, he told me the machine spirit of the Earnest Compliance was gone. Not damaged, not dormant. Gone. Consumed. He said it the way a man says somebody has died, and then he went back to maintaining the Vox equipment and the water purifiers and the emergency lumens in the buildings, and he did it with the same care he had always shown, because a servant of the machine god does not stop serving because one machine has died. There are always others, and each one matters, however small, however temporary, however certain to be consumed in its turn. On day 67 it went again, and not gradually this time. I was on the morning inspection, walking the southern perimeter of the plateau, measuring the growth advance, and I looked up and the sky was different. The color had shifted from that sick amber to something darker, a deep reddish-brown that pulsed with a rhythm I had not felt before, faster and more urgent than the slow planetary heartbeat I had become accustomed to. The structures on the eastern horizon had changed too. Some of them were shorter, some of them were gone entirely, retracted or collapsed or absorbed, I could not tell, and in their place the horizon had a flatness to it that had not been there before. A smoothness, as if the landscape had been leveled and cleaned and prepared for something. Gethin heard me out and then walked to the tower and looked east and stood there a long time without speaking. The world on the eastern horizon, the one we could see when the sky was clear enough. The massive sphere that hung in the sky like a second moon, but was not a moon, was darker. It had been a marbled gray-brown when we arrived, the color of a world being processed, and now it was darker, almost black in places, and the lights that had flickered across its surface for 2 months, the lights that Ulmenden said were not fires but biological processes visible from orbit, were going out. One by one, sector by sector, the lights were dying. Gethin said it out loud a moment later, and I had already got there. The main feast was ending. The world called Scythorn, the hive world that had been the primary target, was finished, consumed. The fleet had eaten everything there was to eat, and the structures were retracting, and the organisms were being reabsorbed, and somewhere in the system, out beyond the range of our dead instruments, something very large and very hungry was turning its attention to the next course, which was us. I had been wrong about the towers since the day I first saw them. They were running, so I assumed Felbreck was being eaten. What those towers had been drawing off a mining world was everything that had ever been alive on it, which here was 12 million people and a skin of engineered lichen, the administratum seated to hold the spoil down. That is not a great deal, and it was finished long before I got there. Rock and metal and water and air do not go up a tower. They go into pools at a rate set by how many organisms you have standing on the ground, and the organisms had all been on Scythorn. The world was not half-eaten. It was finished on the half that can be taken quickly and left sitting for the labor to come free. The labor had just come free. The change on the ground was immediate, and it was terrifying. The feral organisms, the hunters that had been prowling the perimeter for 2 months in their disorganized, instinctive way, stopped. All of them at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. For about 6 hours, the plateau was silent. No movement on the perimeter, no small ones flowing across the ground, no shapes on the distant ridge lines. Nothing. The silence was worse than the noise had been, because the noise had been the sound of something operating without purpose, randomly, hungrily, and the silence was the sound of something receiving instructions. When they came back, they were different. I knew it the moment I saw the first group, 4 of the medium hunters moving along the eastern edge of the plateau. They were not prowling. They were not testing. They were walking in formation, spaced evenly, moving at the same pace, turning at the same moment, as if they were being operated by a single mind from somewhere I could not see. They circled the plateau once, maintaining their spacing, and then they stopped at 4 equidistant points around the perimeter and stood still, facing inward, and did not move. Sentries. They had posted sentries, and the sentries were watching us with an attention that was not the dumb animal hunger of the ferals, but something focused and cold and intelligent, and the pressure behind my eyes spiked so hard I had to sit down. More came. Over the next 3 days, they assembled on the ground around the plateau in numbers I could not count and did not try to, because the number did not matter. What mattered was the coordination, the way they moved together, the way a group of 30 would split into 3 groups of 10, and each group would take up a position that covered an approach the other 2 could not. The way they rotated their facing to track movement inside the perimeter, as if they were all seeing through the same pair of eyes. Larger forms appeared behind the smaller ones, things I had not seen before, taller, more heavily armored, standing upright in a way that made them look almost like men, if you ignored everything about them except the posture. They carried themselves with the authority of officers, which is a strange thing to say about creatures that do not speak and do not think. But the smaller organisms around them behaved differently, moved faster, reacted quicker, as if proximity to the larger forms sharpened something in them that had been dull. Warriors. That is the word I learned from the same Munitorum digest that had told me what was in the refinery wall, from an entry 2 pages further on that described them as synapse creatures and used the phrase nodal relay, and did not explain what either of those things meant to anyone who had to stand in front of one. Nodes of a network that connected the individual organisms to something larger, something that lived in the spaces between them and above them, and inside every one of them simultaneously. The weight in my skull was the edge of that network, the spill of a consciousness so enormous that standing near its lower organisms was like standing near a bonfire and feeling the heat on your skin from 20 meters away. The warriors were the fuel. Where they stood, the fire burned hotter, and the organisms around them burned with it. And what had been a collection of feral animals prowling a perimeter became an army, patient and coordinated and absolutely certain of what it was going to do next. Gethin called a meeting on the evening of day 70. He was not a man who called meetings. He gave orders and expected them to be followed, and the concept of consultation was foreign to him, in the way that democracy is foreign to a las gun, functionally irrelevant to its purpose. The fact that he called one told us what he was going to say. Iskara stood at the back with her arms folded and did not look at anybody, which is what she did when she already knew the answer and was waiting for the room to catch up. He stood in the center of Building 1 with his 31 remaining people around him, and he said 3 things. First, the organisms outside were now coordinated, and the perimeter would not hold against a coordinated assault, which everyone already knew. Second, the fleet that had consumed Scythorn was in the process of turning its attention to Felbreck, and when it arrived, the question of whether the perimeter held would become irrelevant because the process that would begin would not be an assault. It would be a harvest, and a harvest does not negotiate with the crop. Third, there was one ship on this plateau that he believed might still fly, and he was going to try to reach it, and anyone who wanted to come with him could, and anyone who did not was welcome to stay, and he would not think less of them for it. Ulmenden asked which ship. Gethin said the one in Hangar 4, the maintenance bay on the western edge of the port, which I had logged in the second week as the only structure out there still holding its seals. It was a lighter, a short-range orbital shuttle, sealed behind doors that had been closed when the evacuation happened and had remained closed since. Gethin had put his face to the inspection port on our first survey and seen a hull sitting on its gear in the dark, and had not mentioned it to anyone, because at the time there was no point. The sky was closed and a lighter was just a metal box with ambitions. But the sky was not the same sky it had been 67 days ago. The fleet was moving. The weight was shifting, and Ulmenden had something, which he had been chasing since we salvaged the set and had only got hold of in the last 2 days. A Vox set does not talk between stars. It never has, and it never will, and everything that crosses that distance crosses it through an astropath, and ours had died 11 days out of port with the navigator. What a Vox set does is talk across a star system, and ours had not been able to do even that, because the layer of organic tissue sitting on top of Felbreck ate the signal the way it ate everything else. Ulmenden had been listening to that layer since the day he first powered the setup, without knowing it was what he was listening to. What he had noticed in the last 2 days was that it was thinning in places, and thinning is a thing that happens to a membrane when what is on the other side of it is winding the operation down. From the ground, we could not transmit past the fence line. From above the layer, with altitude and nothing between us and open vacuum, we could put a signal across the whole system. We did not have a navigator. We did not have a crew. We did not have a flight plan or a destination or any guarantee that the lighter would start, let alone fly. What we had was a bolt dresser who could assess the structural integrity of a small spacecraft, an engine seer who could talk to its machine spirit, a guard officer who could organize the movement, and a sergeant who could keep people alive for the 11 minutes it would take to cross the open ground that was now surrounded by every Tyranid organism on the western hemisphere of Felbreck. Gethin put one question to me before he planned the crossing. How many people could that lighter carry? That is a structural question, and I answered it structurally, because he had asked me and not somebody else. I had most of the numbers in the log already. A lighter of that class is rated for 32, but rated assumes a maintained airframe on a serviced pad with a full pre-flight. And what we had was a hull that had sat in a sealed bay for 3 months on a world whose atmosphere eats metal. With landing gear I had not been able to inspect and mounting hardware, I had not been able to torque. I told him the airframe would take 28 under load, and that beyond that I could not certify the gear on a hard ascent. That was an honest number. I stand by it now, sitting inside the hull it describes. There were 31 of us when I gave him that number. He came back an hour later with the movement plan, and the plan had 28 people in it, and 3 staying behind, and he never told me, and I never asked whether my figure was the reason, and there is no version of the arithmetic where it was not. 2 of the 3 could not walk. 1 of them could. I gave Gethin a load limit, and Gethin gave the load limit a name, and I did not look at the list. And I have had a long time in a cold crawl space to consider that a man who declines to read the list is still the man who wrote the number at the top of it. Nobody said anything to me about it. 31 people in 2 buildings on a plateau, the size of a parade ground, and every one of them knew by that evening that the number was 28, and where it had come from, because the only man on Felbreck who measured things was me. Arstow knew. Ulmendin knew. The 3 of them knew. People went on handing me the ration tin and asking about the roof panels, and Ulmendin asked me to check a mounting he had already checked himself. A number somebody argues with is a number somebody has to own. 11 minutes. I did the calculation. 300 meters, loaded. Carrying supplies, moving as fast as exhausted, malnourished. Frightened people move across open ground in the dark. 11 minutes from the door of Building 1 to the door of Hangar 4. The organisms had not yet come onto the rockcrete in force. Not yet. But they were massing at the edges, and the coordination was tightening, and the window between now and the moment they decided to stop waiting was a window I could feel closing the same way. I could feel a bolt reaching its torque limit. That subtle give in the metal that tells you the next quarter turn will strip the thread. We went on day 71 in the dark, because the dark on Felbreck was not truly dark, but was darker than the day, and the organisms on the perimeter were marginally less active when the sky dimmed, which was the closest thing to an advantage we were going to get, and so we took it. 28 people left Building 1. 3 stayed behind. 2 of them were injured too badly to move. The 3rd was the soldier from the food fight, who had been standing at the eastern post for 2 days, without sleeping, and who said no quietly when Gethin asked him if he was coming. Gethin looked at him for a moment, and then nodded and moved on. I do not know what happened to the 3 who stayed. I did not look back, and I did not think about them more than once during the crossing, because during the crossing I was thinking about the ground under my feet, and the hangar door ahead, and the darkness on either side of the path, and the sounds coming from that darkness, which were not the sounds of individual animals, but the sound of something collective, something breathing, something adjusting. Gethin had planned the route, straight line, Building 1 to Hangar 4, 312 meters across open rockcrete. No cover, no fallback. Iskara took point with 4 soldiers. Gethin took the rear with 3 more. The rest of us were in the middle, carrying what supplies we could manage, moving as fast as exhaustion and terror allowed, which turned out to be faster than I would have expected because terror is an excellent motivator, and the sounds from the perimeter were providing a generous supply of it. The organisms had not come onto the rockcrete yet. They were at the edge, a line of shapes in the darkness that shifted and rippled and made noises I do not have words for, wet sounds and clicking sounds, and a low resonant hum that I felt in my chest. And they were watching us the way a crowd watches a performer, with an attention that was unified and patient and certain of how the show would end. We were halfway across when they came, not from the perimeter, from underneath. The growth that had been advancing across the rockcrete had, it turned out, been advancing under it as well, threading through the expansion joints and the drainage channels and the microfractures that a working lifetime of orbital landings had put in the surface. What came up through it was not the small ones and not the medium hunters. It was something that had been growing in the substrate for days, and waiting for exactly this moment when every human on the plateau was in the open and moving and committed to a direction and unable to turn back. The ground erupted in 3 places simultaneously, not randomly. 3 places that cut the column into 4 sections, isolating the front from the middle and the middle from the rear. And the things that came out of the ground were fast, and they were precise, and they knew exactly where we would be. What I have of the next 4 minutes is fragments. Iskara shouting orders in a voice that carried over the sound of loss fire and something screaming. A soldier next to me going down and not getting up. Ulmendin, who was carrying the toolkit, walking through the chaos with the same precise, mechanical stride he used in the engine room, as if the things erupting from the ground around him were maintenance issues to be dealt with in order of priority. Gethin firing his last pistol into something that was between him and the rest of the column, firing until the cell died and then using the pistol as a club, which does nothing to chitin and is what a man reaches for when he has run out of everything except stubbornness. Arsto pulling a wounded rating by the collar, dragging him across the rockcrete with one hand and holding a flare in the other. And the flare was the smartest thing anyone did that night because the things from the ground flinched from it. Not from the light, but from the heat. And for the 3 seconds the flare burned. It created a circle of space that moved with her and kept the nearest organisms back. Iskara saved us, and the only witness to how is a bolt dresser who saw it from 50 meters away in the dark while running for his life. When the ground erupted, she was at the front of the column with 4 soldiers, and she was the first person to understand the geometry of what was happening, which was that the eruptions were not random. They were a net, and the net was closing toward the center of the column where the largest number of people were. She had a choice, and she made it in about 2 seconds, which was to take her 4 soldiers and go left, away from the column, away from the hangar, toward the eastern perimeter where the feral organisms that had not yet been pulled into the coordinated assault were still milling in their disorganized, instinctive way. She fired as she ran. She threw flares. She made noise, enormous amounts of noise, lass fire and shouting and the clatter of equipment, and the feral organisms on the eastern edge responded the way ferals respond to stimulation, which is with blind aggression, and they came for her. A flood of chitin and teeth pouring across the rockcrete toward the noise. And the coordinated organisms in the center of the column hesitated just for a moment because the synapse network that was directing them had to account for the sudden movement of a significant number of uncontrolled elements crossing the operational area. And that hesitation was enough. It was enough for 19 people to cover the remaining 130 meters to Hangar 4. It was enough for Ulmenden to reach the door mechanism and apply whatever combination of technical expertise and desperate prayer was required to make it open. It was enough for us to get inside and seal the door behind us and stand in the dark, breathing and bleeding and listening to the sounds outside, which went on for a long time before they stopped. Standing in that dark, I finally had it. The threat digest in the control tower carried a section on Xenos classifications, line drawings, and a paragraph each, and one of the drawings matched what Riddick had described against the refinery wall. 4 sentences under it, clinical, filed between orc fungal propagation and Hive City vermin control. The organism's facial tendrils are used to penetrate the skull of a subdued victim and extract cerebral matter, and examination of that material appears to furnish the wider organism network with the victim's operational knowledge. Riddock had known every post and every rotation. Beldane had known the column order. The others it took in the dark had known the barricade layout and the shift changes and the 90 seconds when the southern post stood empty. It had opened all of them and read all of them. Nothing out there had been guessing. I do not know if Iskara survived that. I did not see her after the column split, and nobody who came through the hangar door had either. And the sounds from the eastern perimeter were not the sounds of a controlled withdrawal. Gethin did not say anything about her. He counted the people in the hangar, and he got to 19. 28 had left Building 1. 9 of them were on the rock crete behind us, and he looked at the number, and the number looked back at him, and neither of them had anything to say to the other. He was bleeding from a wound on his left arm that he had not mentioned, and that I only noticed because the blood was dripping onto the deck plate in a rhythm I could time. And when Arstow told him to let her look at it, he said after, which on Felbreck meant never, but which served the purpose of ending the conversation. The lighter was there, sealed in the maintenance bay behind a secondary door that Ulmenden opened with tools from his kit, and a patience that seemed inhuman, until I remembered that parts of him literally were. It was an orbital lighter, standard Munitorum issue, rated for short-range atmospheric and transorbital flight, capacity 32, and it was sitting on its landing gear in the dark, with its access ramp down, and its cargo bay empty, and its systems cold and quiet and dead. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, which tells you something about what Felbreck does to a man's aesthetic standards. Ulmenden went aboard. He was gone for 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, the sounds from outside changed, shifted, got closer, and the door we had sealed was a maintenance door designed to keep out weather and ground crews, not synapse-coordinated alien organisms with an operational plan. I could hear them working on it, not hammering, not tearing, working on it the way a locksmith works on a lock, testing, probing, finding the mechanism and learning its weaknesses, and every few minutes the door would shudder in its frame and I would look at the bolts holding the hinges and make a professional assessment of how much longer they would hold and revise my estimate downward. Ulmenden came back with a status report delivered in the order a machine would want it heard. The machine spirit was dormant, not dead. Fuel cells were enough for orbital insertion and a little above it, which was not enough to reach anywhere and was enough to get off the ground, and at that moment nobody in the hangar wanted anything else. Drive system functional, atmospheric seals intact, navigation operational at the basic level, meaning it could tell us where we were and where the local celestial bodies were, and could not interface with the Immaterium in any way, the Immaterium not being available for interfacing. Then the only part that was a question, 2 hours to bring the reactor online safely, or 40 minutes to bring it online unsafely. Gethin said 40. Ulmenden said I anticipated that. He had already started before he asked. A servant of the machine god had performed an unsanctioned procedure at speed on a machine he had known for 1 hour, without being told twice, and he never mentioned it afterwards, to me or to anybody. I spent those 40 minutes doing my job. I dug my wrench out of the kit bag, the same one I had been holding when the frame at 47 let go, which I had crawled back in after on the 3rd day, and carried 14 kilometers, and had not needed once since. I went through that lighter from nose to tail, and I checked every bolt and every fastener and every structural joint I could access, and I wrote the results in my maintenance log with the pencil stub I had been carrying since day 1, and the results were acceptable. The lighter had been maintained before it was parked. Its bolts were dressed, its seals were good, its frame was solid. Someone, months or years ago, had done their job properly, had tightened and checked and recorded and moved on to the next task. And that anonymous act of professional diligence was the reason 19 people had a chance of leaving the surface of Felbreck alive. I do not know who that person was. I hope they made it off the world. I suspect they did not. The work they left behind was clean, and nobody else is going to put that anywhere, so I am putting it here. The reactor did not come online at 40 minutes. It came online at 46, and I spent the last 6 of those watching the top hinge on the maintenance door walk itself out of its frame at about twice the rate I had allowed for. I had been revising that figure downward all evening, and I was still generous. The maintenance bay door, the big one, the one that opened onto the landing pad, was mechanical, driven by a hydraulic ram that Ulmenden powered from the lighter's own auxiliary system, and it opened with a sound like a giant exhaling, slow and steady and final. Outside was the plateau. The sky was that deep biological red, pulsing, alive, and the organisms were on the rock-crete now. Hundreds of them. Thousands. A carpet of shapes moving in patterns that looked like writing or circuitry, or the pathways of a nervous system viewed from above. And they were between us and the open pad, and they were all facing the hangar door. Gethin did not hesitate. He gave the order, and Ulmenden engaged the drive, and the lighter moved forward onto the pad, through the organisms, which parted and did not part. Some of them crushed under the landing gear, and some of them climbing onto the hull, and some of them doing something to the fuselage that I could hear through the walls as a scraping, dissolving sound that meant they were trying to eat through the outer skin, while we were still on the ground. The lighter accelerated. The organisms fell away or held on, and the ones that held on burned when Ulmenden pushed the drive to full atmospheric power, and the exhaust wash turned the pad behind us into a furnace that I saw through the aft viewport as a flat white light that swallowed everything. We went up. The lighter shook and bucked, and the atmospheric seal on the starboard aft quarter started weeping where something had breached the outer layer, and I made a note in my log, and the note said, "Starboard aft seal compromised. Estimated integrity loss, 2%. Serviceable." And that was the last entry I made on the surface of Felbreck. We broke atmosphere on the day side, which meant I got to see Felbreck from above. The lighter's recording systems were not functional. What follows is not enough, and it is what there is. From up there, you could see exactly what I had worked out far too late to be of any use to anybody. There was a line across that world, the boundary between what had been taken and what was still waiting. And it was not a neat line, not a border. It was a fractal edge, tendrils and tongues and filaments of organic coverage reaching into the remaining territory like fingers closing around what was left. The processed areas were smooth. Not bare rock, not cratered, not scarred. Smooth the way skin is smooth, with a surface texture that caught the light in a way rock does not. And the color was wrong, a dark reddish-brown that was the color of the sky from underneath and the color of something alive from above. The remaining areas, the ones that had not yet been reached, looked normal from that height. Gray-brown rock and mining infrastructure and the pale lines of roads. But they were shrinking, visibly, as if the planet were being swallowed from the edges inward. At the boundary, the structures I had seen from the ground were visible as points of contact between the surface and something above, pillars of biological material that reached into the upper atmosphere and connected to a layer of organic tissue sitting on top of the world like a membrane, thin enough to see through and thick enough to change the color of everything underneath it. The membrane was feeding. I could see it, the way you can see a river from above, the flow of material, the currents and eddies and confluences where biomass was being drawn upward through the pillars and distributed across the layer and from there to somewhere I could not see because it was above us and we were moving too fast. The fleet. The membrane was the fleet's interface with the planet, the proboscis through which it was drinking Felbreck, and we had been living underneath it for 71 days like bacteria in a stomach. which I suppose is exactly what we were. I looked away from Felbreck and looked up, and that is when I saw them. I am going to call them ships, which is the wrong word, and the only one I have. They were above us, occupying an orbit that was not an orbit, because orbits are curves, and these things were stationary, hanging in space the way a predator hangs above its prey, motionless and patient and vast. I counted 6 before I stopped counting, because the 7th was so large that the concept of counting stopped being meaningful. The same way you do not count a mountain, you just acknowledge that it is there, and that everything around it is defined by its presence. They were organic. Every line, every surface, every protrusion and cavity and trailing appendage was biological, grown and shaped and alive. And the largest one had a surface area that my mind refused to calculate because the calculation would have produced a number that did not belong in the same universe as a bolt dresser from a Munitorum transport. They were not interested in us. A lighter carrying 19 people broke atmosphere in the middle of a feeding operation, and the fleet did not react. Not a twitch, not a shift, not a single organism dispatched to investigate. We were not a threat. We were not prey, not at that scale, not in those numbers. We were a rounding error, a speck of biomass so negligible that collecting it would cost more than it returned. And the thing above us, if it registered us at all, made the assessment a man makes about a crumb going off the edge of his plate. Ulmendin had the set open before we finished climbing. He said in his flat metal voice that from this altitude the frequencies were clean for the first time since the crash, and that the equipment would carry across the system and no further. Not a message, because there was nobody in this system to receive a message, and nothing outside it that a Vox set can reach. A beacon. The hazard pattern on the Imperial navigation frequency, repeating, for as long as the set has power. Gethin wanted to know who that was for. For whoever comes out where we came out, Ulmendin said. What good would that do them? Gethin said. Ulmendin had been asked whether the set would carry across the system, and it would, and the rest was not his department. We put it up. Ulmendin built the pattern in a format I did not recognize, compressed and repeating, carrying what little would fit about Felbreck and the fleet and the dead ships on the pad and the thing in the warp that had kept them there. Not a distress call. Gethin was clear about that. A distress call asks for rescue, and there was nothing out there to ask. Our charts said Felbreck, mining world, subsector Oldarin, tithe grade exactus tertius, clean water, adequate approach, no hazard noted. Landing here was never the danger. The danger is the stretch of warp a navigator plots across when a chart tells him there is a working mining world under it, and no chart says otherwise because saying otherwise means somebody comes out here and looks, and that is the one thing this system does not permit. We could not correct the chart. We could put one line of it in the way of the next man who reads it. It is running now. It has been running since we cleared the layer, and it will run until the cells go, and it says the same 4 things over and over into a system with nothing in it but us and the thing above Felbreck. The pattern saves nobody. A hull that comes out here is in the same box we are in, because the warp is shut for arrivals the same way it is shut for departures. I took that to Ulmendin, and he said the transmission was functional and the frequency was correct, which is not an answer, and is the only kind of answer he has ever given anybody. We needed 71 days to find out what had happened to us, and every one of them was a day somebody was still planning. A crew that hears our pattern will know inside the hour. That is the whole of it. I put it up anyway. Then it was fuel, and Ulmendin gave a figure rather than a reassurance. 38% remaining, which came to roughly 216 minutes of sustained burn at current output. What was in reach in that time, in any direction? Ulmendin brought up the navigation display instead of answering, which was the answer. The nearest system was 14 light-years away, a number that means nothing at sub-light speed, the only speed available to a lighter without a warp drive, which this one did not have because lighters do not have warp drives because lighters are not designed to leave the system they are launched in, which is a design philosophy that I now consider to be a significant oversight. The fleet was behind us. Felbreck was behind us, below us, and behind us, and shrinking. A world becoming a marble, becoming a point of light, becoming nothing. And ahead of us was the space between stars, cold and empty, and it does not care about bolt dressers or lieutenants or dead shipmasters or sergeants who may or may not have survived a sacrificial run across a spaceport on a world that was being eaten alive. Ahead of us was the burn, and after the burn, drift. Cold drift in the dark, 19 people in a lighter designed for 32, with enough rations for maybe 40 days and enough water for less, and enough power to keep the air breathable for about 3 months, so we will run out of food long before we run out of air. The Munitorum would have approved of the margin. The buildings had another 46 days in them, by my own figures. The fleet spared me finding out whether I had that number right. 18 of the 19 will find out which of those runs out first. Arsto got Gethin's sleeve off about an hour after we broke atmosphere, which was about 4 hours after he took it, and Felbreck gives you 2. The arm was already the wrong color up past the elbow. She cleaned it and dressed it with counterseptic and bandage, which is the same care we gave Lutin, and works on the same half of the problem. He has not asked anybody for anything since. He sits forward with his back against the bulkhead and answers when spoken to, and gets a little warmer every watch, and there is nothing on this hull that treats what he has, and both of us can put a finger on the line in our own casualty list where somebody already went that way. I gave him a load limit, and he gave it a name, and the arithmetic is going to take him off his own list without any help from me. I sat down in the lighter's maintenance crawl space, because that is where I fit. Arsto came and found me there. She had the Compliance's ship log with her, the actual bound volume, carried out of the wreck on the morning of the march, and kept in her kit through 71 days and 1 crossing under fire. She put it on the deck plate next to me. The promise to Laten had been that the last entry would be accurate, and she had written it that morning at the spaceport, and it said the Earnest Compliance was lost with all hands except 43, and then 31, and then 19, with the causes recorded as far as she knew them. Was accurate the right word, she wanted to know, for a document nobody was going to read? I told her accurate is a property of the writing and not of the reading, which is the only sentence I have ever said that sounded like something Ulmendin would say. And she looked at me for a moment, and then she almost laughed, and then she went forward and strapped in. She left the volume where it was. There are 100 and some blank pages in it after her entry, and a ship's log is a document with rules about who may write in it. And none of those rules cover a rating second class, filling the back half with everything that happened on Felbreck, because the drift is going to be long, and there is nothing else to do with the hours. That is what this is. Nobody is going to read it, and I have already given somebody the answer to that. When it was done, I closed her book and opened my own, and wrote the last entry that will go in it. Not about Felbreck, about the lighter. A structural assessment in the format I had been trained to use 22 years ago at the Merchant Fleet Depot on Ossendral, the format that lists every structural element by location and status and estimated remaining service life. And I was thorough, and I was accurate, and I was professional, because that is what I am, and I was not going to stop being it now. Frame structure intact. Keel bolts dressed, torques within tolerance. Hull plating serviceable, minor pitting from atmospheric exposure. Starboard aft seal compromised at one point, patched with sealant from the emergency kit. Holding. Port landing gear housing. Structural crack in the upper mount, non-critical, does not affect flight envelope. Internal framing, sound. Fasteners, all accounted for, all tightened, all holding. Life support, ducting, secure. Reactor housing within normal parameters per Cog Adept Ulmenden's assessment, which I accept because that is his department and not mine. Overall structural assessment of orbital lighter, Departmento Munitorum, serial number illegible, current location high orbit over Felbreck, subsector Oldarin, serviceable, estimated remaining service life longer than the fuel, signed Nyle Borrodh, bolt dresser, rating 2nd class, formerly of the Earnest Compliance, currently of nowhere in particular. The bolts are good. The rest is above my pay grade.